invitation, and it's a great privilege to be in Ireland. There's so much happening in the field of education. I mean, it's a country that has gone on through a very difficult period economically, but sort of not lost the momentum of genuine change in the field of education. I learned a lot during this morning alone on this. I just show my presentation here. I'll just get that. And I want to start by talking about schooling and education, just sort of why all of this has become so important. In fact, you might ask why the OECD as an economic organization puts such a premium now on education and skills. And it's simply because we have data that show that this is basically the primary driver of many social and economic outcomes. We did something, Sean, you mentioned it, not a PISA in the schools, but we actually tested entire populations for their foundation skills. And we looked at the economic and social outcomes. And you can see, for example, very strong linkages with employment. People at the high end of the skill distribution are more than twice as likely to be employed. They are more than 3 times, or almost 3 times as likely to earn an above medium wage. So economic outcomes are increasingly driven by the skills of people. In fact, you can do that at the aggregate level as well. Much of the inequality that we see in income and many other dimensions today is driven by variability in the skills of people. And that impact has grown a lot over the last years. But it doesn't end with money. You can see a relationship with health, with the propensity of people to volunteer. You can see that people at the high end of the skill distribution see themselves as actors in political processes. People at the low end of the skill distribution see themselves as objects of political processes. And even things like trust, that's the most interesting thing. You think, and trust is the glue of our societies. It's the foundation for any business transaction. You know what? You might think that has to do with how you were brought up, your families, the institutions, your country, and so on. In fact, you can predict a fair share of the differences in the trust people have by the level of foundation skills. So really, much of the outcomes we talk about really comes down to what people know and what they can do with what they know. Another sort of preface that I want to make here is that we are all doing better in education. Almost any education system is improving somehow. But there are big challenges facing us. The kind of things that are easy to teach and test are also the kind of things that are easy to digitize, automate, and outsource, and lose in labor market relevance. That is a huge challenge to how we learn, how we teach, and so on. And today, what you know gets you only that far. The world economy doesn't pay you anymore for what you know. Google knows everything. The world economy pays you for what you can do with what you know, and that makes such a very important difference. I want to show you this just with one piece of data. Unfortunately, I don't have data for Ireland here. I use the United States as an example. Look at the evolution of skill demand. Now, when you look at manual skills, well, that's pretty obvious. Those skills got automated. Machines do those things better than people. No? When you look at non-routine manual skills, that's sort of a little bit less clear. This has been pretty much stable in the recent decades because there are a lot of jobs out there that you do with your hands, but that don't require great skills. But the steepest decline in the demand for skills has actually happened in what we call routine cognitive skills. And I'm going to come back to this when I talk about the PISA results, including for Ireland. I think we have to really look at those kind of evolutions very, very carefully. The steepest or a steep increase in the demand for skills has been in what we call non-routine analytic skills. This is not reproducing what you know, but extrapolating from it. Applying, using your knowledge in a novel situation. The kind of thing that we're trying to capture with instruments like PISA. And then non-routine interpersonal skills, social skills, even steeper increase. And I know everybody says how important these are. We all put this in the preamble of curricula. But then at the end of the day, we give students an individual test or exam. So in a way, taking this really to heart. Is look at a few decades, and you see really there are big shifts in our economies in terms of labor utilization. And I know many people will say, reform is rapid, it's changing too fast, everything. But, you ask yourself, how well did our school system actually adapt in this rather, we're talking about a short period of history here. very deep changes. And that brings me sort of just to the PISA. I just sort of give you a few highlights on the nature of the program. Basically, it's a test. Now that's administered to about 500,000 students, randomly selected. And again, we are trying to go beyond looking at just whether students know what they were taught. We're looking to what extent they can use and apply their knowledge creatively. And we're doing that for the reasons that I've shown you before in major subject fields. And then we collect a lot of contextual data to get a sense of what actually drives those differences that we observe across countries. PISA is not there to tell us, which system is the highest or the lowest performing countries. Now, that wouldn't tell you very much. It's there to tell us what are the kind of levers that actually drive differences in education outcomes. Let's have a look at some of the results. One of the first lessons that we actually drew from this is that we frame a lot of the educational debate in terms of making choices between quality, equity, trade-offs. No? And one of the first things that you see from PISA is that high-performing education systems get both things right. They do really well, and they actually enable success for almost any student. You can see that in the data. I mean, that's just sort of a very simple kind of thing the media like to do. You're putting countries in a rank order, and you can see that some countries, and particularly in East Asia, but also, Europe, some countries do really well. Canada. Then you get to the average performance in yellow, and then in red countries, there's sort of below and average performance. So there's a lot of variability in what 15-year-olds, these are the people who we tested, in different countries know. No? 40 points on the scale is one school year. So actually there are 6 to 7 years of schooling separating the countries you can see. And I'm not even showing you the countries with a very low performance. No? You can see Ireland is sort of in the middle when you look at mathematics, the major subject. When you look in reading and science, this is where Ireland is doing well, sort of seen a slight dip on reading, increase in science, but pretty stable overall in a picture. Mathematics is something that students are most challenged with, something that we put in focus in 2012. But that's just one dimension. I want to put in the equity dimension into the picture. And in some countries, social background is a powerful driver of student success. No? In other countries, learning opportunities are far more equitably distributed. No? Everybody wants to be there where performance is good and there are no social disparities. Nobody wants to be here where performance is poor and there are large disparities. It's pretty obvious. But then comes the question, you want to aim to be there where performance is good on average, but at the price that some people from disadvantaged backgrounds don't do well? Or do you want to focus on equity and accept mediocrity? That's sort of much of the debate in which we have framed education. And I'm going to come back to this. But when you look at actually the outcomes, this is where countries actually come out. You can see there is no obvious kind of quadrant that sort of privileges countries. You can actually see there are a lot of countries in this green quadrant, in every corner of the world. Countries that actually do well, and that do well for students from all socioeconomic backgrounds. I want to bring in one last dimension, and that's money. I don't have data for all countries, so you see fewer dots here. And I'm going to make the dots that you see here proportional to the spending per student. Now you can see Ireland right in the middle. It's an average performer in quality, an average performer on equity, and sort of average spender as well. The larger dots are the higher spending countries, the smaller dots are the less spending countries per student. And if money would tell you everything about the quality of an education system, you'd find all the large bubbles at the top and all the small bubbles at the bottom. No? It's not what you see. In fact, volume of spending is a pretty bad predictor of the learning outcomes in a school system. That brings me to the next lesson, is actually how you spend your money. That tells you actually a lot more. Let's have a look at this. And again, it shows you how we can use data to drill down. One way in which you can spend money is to pay your teachers well, relative to other things. Where the bar goes up, that's the case. I highlight here Korea. They try to pay their teachers relatively well. The Koreans also have their students sitting in school for longer hours than other countries. The bar goes up further. And they do one third thing. They say we want our teachers also to actually do other things than teaching. How do they pay for this? with large classes. No? The bar drags down. They don't spend a lot overall. They're actually a low spending country. That's what you can see here. They're a below average spending country. And you can go to a country in a very different culture, Finland, and you can see remarkable similarities. No? The Finns, too, they don't spend a lot of money on education. People always say they must spend a lot of money because they do all these wonderful things there. But in fact, they don't. They actually prioritize their spending in very similar ways many East Asian countries. No? They put the premium on the quality of instruction. They pay for it with larger classes. You can see Ireland actually does many things similar to those countries. Now, teachers are really paid well relative to spending capacity, but actually class sizes are driving things up. And the time teachers have for other things than teaching actually drives spending down. Is that the smartest way of spending money? Those are the kind of questions. You couldn't see that possibly in a national framework. Ireland could never answer that question for itself because those things are constant in a country. Now you pay one salary to every teacher. Once you can actually look at this across countries, you can actually see spending choices and how they matter. Last point, trends. Some people say, well, this is all about culture. This is telling you that some countries just have a more favorable kind of context in which to do education. If that would be the case, this picture would be pretty constant over time. But it's not. I want to show you a few differences. If you look at the very top end of the scale, you can see a country or system like Shanghai moving from good to great. We would need a second screen to show them now. Or to Singapore. They came from here, they moved up there. But it's not just at the top, and you can see important movements at the bottom. And one of the most impressive examples for me is Turkey. Look where they are, and look where they were. They were moving upwards and rightwards. They were actually raising performance and closing social gaps with very little money, and the dot remains small. Germany got a big shock when they saw the PISA results first, not because the dot was too low, but because it was very much on the left side, on the side of social disparities. They were actually able to reduce those social disparities by a very, very large margin. Italy, another country, moving upwards, rightwards. Poland, very impressive performance gains. In fact, the most impressive performance gains in Europe. You can look at Portugal. Went through a very tough period, consolidating its entire schooling system. It was financially unsustainable. They had to close a lot of schools, restructure the schools. A very, very difficult period. They lost a bit out on equity, but overall, they moved up to an almost average performance by OECD standards. Very, very impressive. Some countries have moved rightwards. Now, Norway didn't succeed to move upwards, but they succeeded to actually make the system even more equitable. The United States, the same thing. A lot of people said the United States remained flat. Now, that's what you read in the media. And it is because the United States didn't raise performance. But it actually was quite good in closing some of the social gaps. And then Switzerland did the same thing at a very high level of performance. In a nutshell, there's been a lot of movement in a lot of countries. For Ireland, there's been some movement, but it's pretty moderate. An improvement in science, slight decline in reading, mathematics pretty stable. But I think that's, in my view, the most encouraging insight from PISA. You can change things. With a sustained reform effort, you can actually make a big difference. And in a short period of history, the relative standing of countries has actually changed by quite large margin. I want to show you this in how countries have closed socioeconomic gaps. Now, this is the performance gap between the quarter of the most disadvantaged students and the privileged students in 2003 in Germany. That's what they did by 2012, lifting the bottom end, and that's basically what enabled them to improve. If you look at the United States, this is how they looked in 2003 and 2012. That's not the way you want to close achievement gaps. No. They lost out in excellence to raise performance at the bottom end. Poland, again, they succeeded both ways. You could see how the entire distribution actually has been rising. They were able to actually get both ends of the distribution moving. A lot of change in a short period of history. I want to just highlight one point on the performance distribution that we attribute great importance to, and that is what share of your students actually make it to the top end of the distribution. That is where students, in the case of mathematics, have to think mathematically. This is not something which, nothing you learn in the classroom will help you to answer those questions. You have to do advanced mathematical modeling tasks and so on. And you can see actually in the case of Shanghai, more than half of the student population reaches that level of excellence. This tells us, there's a lot of potential in our society. If you believe that, genes are randomly distributed in the world, you can get every second student to become a top performer in the entire distribution. That's something where Ireland has a long way to go. It's just about 1 in 10 students reaching those kinds of students. It's pretty much average. The OECD average is 13%. But you can really see you can raise that proportion by almost 5 times, in theory. Why is it important? Well, and in reading and science, actually, Ireland is, in reading at least, is better on that dimension. Why is it so important? Look at evolution of employment. For people with so-so problem-solving skills, this is what we measured in our adult skills assessment, we've actually seen a deterioration in employment. If you have average skills, you've actually lost your jobs. People with very low skills have seen no changes in employment because they earn less and less, and the wage gap goes up. But you keep your job because there are still in our economies a pretty constant share of low-paying, low-skilled jobs. But again, the job growth really has happened precisely at the top end of the distribution. So paying attention to excellence in education is really important. We should not see this as a competing policy objective to equity. One of the important insights from this work, but again, you can see in a short period of time, we're talking about 10, 15 years here, big changes in employment patterns in the OECD area that show how important it is to get all parts of the distribution right on this. I want to just sort of talk about one aspect in this we call resilience, socioeconomic resilience. A lot of people in education say this is all about poverty. Children growing up in poor families, less educated families, going to have a hard time wherever they go to school. And that is true in every country. Social background is a big barrier. But again, what international comparisons tell us is that you can do something about this. I want to show you this with some data from the PISA assessment. I've ordered performance by decile. Now, if you are in the red dot, you come from the 10% poorest families. If you're in the green dot, you come from the 10% richest families. And you can see actually how wealth makes a difference in the case of Mexico. And there's nothing wrong with the Mexicans. You can see the same picture in Chile. Even worse. If you come from a poor family, you're worse off in Chile than you are in Mexico. If you come from a wealthy family, you're doing better in school than you do in the case of Mexico. And then you can go through this country by country, and you reach Ireland. You can see also similar patterns there. And it's true for many countries, but then you look to the end, and you can see there are where things get differently. And you look at this across countries, and you can see the poorest kid in Shanghai. The children of room cleaners, can compete with the children of professions around other countries, including Ireland. Again, this tells us how much potential of children we can actually leverage in the school system. There is actually poverty is not destiny. It's a factor influencing student success everywhere. But there's a lot of scope that we have actually to leverage the talent of children from disadvantaged contexts. Some countries doing a lot better on this than others. And that's basically, if you look at the countries that are particularly successful in this in East Asia, they simply do not have any tolerance for failure. They invest the resources, whatever it takes, to leverage the talent of disadvantaged children. But you as a student, then nobody's going to make your life easier because you come from a disadvantaged background, or you're an immigrant or whatever. People expect, and they put in the resources that takes to actually get students to those kinds of education. I think it's one of the most powerful illustrations that we actually get from these kind of international comparisons. Problem solving, something that we assessed as well in this part. And when you can see actually, if mathematics and problem solving would be the same, you would see everybody on a straight line. People who are doing well on mathematics also doing well on problem solving. It's not what we see in all countries. The United States and England are interesting examples. The people who are doing well in mathematics, they're even better in problem solving. The United States does not do well on PISA, on the math test. But many kids actually have the capacity to solve creatively problems, particularly if they succeed in school. If you look at Japan, similar picture. Japanese have become a lot better on creative problem-solving skills over time, particularly at the low end of the spectrum. But then you get to Spain, where you can actually see it's the other way around. The Spanish education system does a decent job in conveying school content. Students have a harder time applying this to problems. And then you can see Poland and Ireland with the same pattern and quite consistently across the entire performance spectrum. This tells you it's probably something in the nature of the learning experience. Someone this morning said, does it have to do that you delivered this test on a computer? Is it ICT experience? I wouldn't say so, because we see actually a very similar picture when we look at mathematics itself. Students actually do less well in Ireland on mathematics tests that require creative skills to solve problems than when they are about to sort of basically explain mathematical phenomena or express things that they have learned. Very important. And then Singapore is on a straight line. Students do well on everything. They have actually squared that circle in a system that actually used to focus a lot on rote learning. If you go to Singapore 20 years ago, that was the country of rote learning. They have cut the corner. They've changed instructional practice and are actually number one now on the problem-solving test. Very interesting experience. And you can see relative strengths and weaknesses of countries. Ireland is not alone in that. There are a lot of countries that struggle more on creative skills than on content knowledge. But it's something to think about. Why? Because, again, it's those kind of skills that in the modern economy play an increasingly important role. Let's look unfortunately in PISA, one of our dreams is actually to build in classroom observation, that we get a better picture of the nature of the instructional environment. We don't have that, but we actually ask students about the nature of instruction. Students are usually quite reliable source of what actually happens in the classroom. Here we ask them, for example, to what extent they get exposed to formal mathematics. And no country beats Ireland on that. Number one on this. So students actually get a lot of exposure to formal mathematics. In other countries, that's much less the case. If you are in Sweden, Iceland, and so on, it's a lot less the case. There's a lot of mathematics teaching isn't mathematics teaching. Mathematics gets taught in very, very different ways in different countries. You can look at application. Pictures very, very different. Here you can see some countries putting a lot more emphasis than Ireland on applied mathematics. A lot of variability across countries. And you can ask yourself, what's the right balance? One way is to look at, well, how do countries score overall? The other is actually to relate this directly to performance. You can see something very interesting. This is applied mathematics. You can see actually, if you never apply mathematics, you actually do worse on a test. If you do it sometimes, you get to the optimum. If you do it always, it's not a good thing either. So it's a question of balance. And international comparisons can tell you something about that balance. It's very difficult to frame in the abstract. Experts have very different views on this. But you can actually look. PISA is not good in telling you what you need to do in Ireland, but it's telling you what everybody else is doing and with what consequences. And that, I think, is a really good source of inspiration. Mathematics teaching is happening in very different ways across different classrooms around the world. One point I thought it was important to highlight about Ireland is that, when you look at the overall average performance, one temptation might be, okay, let's fix a few schools and everything is going to improve. That does work in countries where you can actually isolate performance. It's not the case in Ireland. Ireland is remarkably consistent in its overall performance throughout the school system. You can see that in the data. This is the share of performance variation that lies between schools. Now, Ireland is among the most consistent performers on this. Very little performance variation between schools. I know there's a lot of excitement about, publishing school-level data. Actually, I think nothing happen if you would publish them, because all schools have the same results. But there's more variation within the schools. And this is a very, very important message. If you want to change the relative performance on this, you actually have to work on a lot of students in a lot of classrooms and a lot of teachers in a lot of schools across the country. It's really sort of very important to keep this in mind. If you are in Chinese Taipei, it's the other way around. You can basically say almost half of the variation lies between schools. You can actually zoom in fix a few schools, change the results. That will not work in Ireland. That's something, it's actually even true, even in countries like England, where there's a lot of focus on schools, this is just less than a third of the performance variation there. That is something which makes it sort of much harder for public policy to make changes in the short term, because it really means changing the culture. But I thought sharing this with you, I think it's a really important facet of the results, that this is about, individual performance rather than group performance. So, catching up with the top performers, what have we learned? It's the most interesting part. I want to rank the kind of things I talk about by their impact on outcomes, but also keep in mind the political and economic cost of reforms. Of course, everybody wants to focus on the quick wins, things that are very important and easy to do. No. Nobody wants to touch things that are actually very hard to do and not so important. But, unfortunately, we find lots of things in the box. I'm not going to talk about them today, but I think this is obvious. You want to move the agenda forward, and I think actually Ireland, I find really courageous on this. Ireland is actually tackling some of the must-haves that are actually of longer-term strategic relevance. If you think about your curriculum reform, this is not something you're going to see in tomorrow's PISA outcomes, but those things need to happen. And then you can always pick up some low-hanging fruits, things that are easy to do, maybe not so important, but they don't cost you very much. If you look at this, so what have we learned? I'm going to highlight these things one by one, but actually you can put different types of efforts in different corners of this diagram. And I want to start with something that looks really trivial, but it is absolutely fundamental, and that's this commitment to universal achievement. And now you'll tell me, well, everybody has this. And in fact, I would think Ireland is one of the countries that has most of the kind of education capital in the population. You have a population that really values education. You have parents that care about it. This is one of the biggest assets the country has. No? So you might think, okay, we have solved that problem. It's not so easy. No? We ask 15-year-old students, what do you believe makes you successful in mathematics? And there were still a lot of students in Ireland who would tell us, well, it's obvious, this is all a matter of talent. If I'm not born as a genius in mathematics, I study something else. No. The message is, it's not about me. It's not about, education is about sorting people. If you ask that very same question to a Japanese or a Chinese student, 9 out of 10 tell you, if I try really hard, I trust my teachers are going to help me and I'm going to be successful. So students in those education systems see themselves as their masters of their own success. And they know if they invest the efforts, they're going to see the results. And that is something, the commitment to education is also to do with the extent to which we are able to convey to people, to children, that actually education is about them and the school is framed around their individual needs. What we see in those top-performing countries is universal educational standards. Now, everybody, every student, every parent, every teacher knows what counts for success. High degree of individualization or personalization in learning experiences. By the way, something that we have found no relationship with class size. No. The degree of perceived individualization in the learning process is unrelated to the size of class, at least with the data that we collected. As opposed to a belief that, students have different destinations, that we put in different types of schools and tracks. Now, my country, Germany, very good at that. That's not something that actually relates to better outcomes. There's also very good articulation of who is actually responsible for ensuring student success. Now, what's the role of students, parents, teachers? Now, accountability in those high-performing countries is not about, one test for one purpose, but it's about, getting every part of the education system to be accountable. Let me show you a couple of data points on this. This is basically this issue of high expectations for students. No? We have measured something that we call self-efficacy in mathematics. This is not whether you believe you're great in mathematics, but it's exactly what I mentioned before. The extent to which you believe you can actually address unsurmountable problems. That effort is going to help you to change things. You can see here the Chinese at the top of both performance, vertical, and that self-efficacy. And you can see there is a relationship within it across countries on this. Ireland is not doing badly. It's sort of somewhere at the center of this. But it is something where we can education systems generally in Europe can become better in giving students that kind of sense. So you can look at this the other way around, who do students blame when they are not successful? No? And you can see here, this is the average. This is Shanghai, this is Ireland. And Ireland is close to the OECD average, but you still have a fair share of students who basically say, you know, I've just been unlucky, or the teacher didn't get me interested in the material, or their course material is too hard. So, you know, students blame almost anyone except themselves or their own role in this. And that's something I think teaches us about the nature and the variability in the nature of the learning environments that we see across countries. Continuum of support, one of the things that we see, and this is sort of the counterpart of this. Some people say, well, aren't East Asian countries, or maybe Finland. Finland is a great example of high expectations as well. Very, very tough sort of on every part of the system. Some people say, well, isn't that too tough to students to make their life a misery and so on. We find no sort of, this doesn't turn down at some point. The higher the expectations, the better the outcomes, provided these expectations are combined with individual support, perceived by the students. That's the variable that counts. And you can actually see what is behind this. In fact, it has to do with making learning central, encouraging engagement and student responsibility, making students part of the learning process, being sensitive to individual differences, understanding that students learn differently, embracing diversity with differentiated pedagogical strategies, continual assessment, feedback. And that's, by the way, something, again, I think where Ireland is making a very important step, strengthening school responsibility. You will not understand how students learn until you are able to actually evaluate, mark their work and learning. And not sort of on a one-off basis, but on a basis day by day. Demand on every student. We talked about this, ensuring that every student feels actually valuable and included in the learning experience. And those are things that vary across schools, they vary across countries, and that tells us we can actually shape those kinds of learning environments. Parents, another important part. I mean, you know that when you expect your parents, when parents have high expectations on their children, children will do better in school, but actually the story doesn't end here. You can even see that there's a positive relationship with the enjoyment of mathematics. I found this really hard to believe when I saw this data, but it's quite consistent across countries. Parents which expect children to do better in school or to university or whatever have students who enjoy more what they learn. And that is holding after accounting for social background. So you're not just seeing here social stratification. Persistence, positive relationship as well. Those factors are really important. And this is kind of this parent equation. In fact, I was really intrigued. In November last year, I visited a couple of schools in one of the poorest provinces in China, where the first generation of children was educated. These children had parents who had no education whatsoever, and it was a boarding school. And what you could really see, the effort that teachers invested in every parent. And the teachers would call up every parent of every child twice per week to really follow up, this is what we're doing with the children, this is why we are doing this. Huge levels of sort of trying to draw parents into this. And you can see why these things are making such a difference. Gateways, instructional systems, I don't need to say much about this. I think Ireland is doing really well on this, has sort of a well-established delivery chain through which you translate curricular goals, instructional practices. I think that part of the system, I think it will be quite obvious to you. High level of metacognitive of content of instruction, that's maybe more worth highlighting. This is exactly the point. Do students understand that mathematics is not just sort of an agglomeration of formulas, equations, theorems, but a language with which you can understand, structure, predictable, like history, like the arts. All of these are different ways to sort of, for us to deal with the world. And actually, if students have got those metacognitive competences, they also outperform on this kind of test that we have. Let's get to the harder part of the agenda, capacity at the point of delivery. Again, I would think that Ireland is well positioned there. You have a very attractive teaching profession, a profession that is really getting great people into this. Many other countries in Europe are struggling with this. Teaching has become less attractive in most countries for which we have comparative data. But it's also a question of how do you invest in the continued development of teachers, retain great people in school, how you provide the kind of instructional leadership for making this happen, and so on. And there's a lot, I think, that we can learn in Europe from things that are happening outside Europe now, where basically the profession is advancing very, very rapidly. A lot of also time investment being made. You go to Shanghai, you talk about 240 hours being invested in every teacher every year in their initial years. This is a lot of time, a lot of effort being made. Singapore, 100 hours every year, every teacher. A lot of responsibility on people also to grow in their professional pathways. You can't stand still in those systems. You have to figure out, do I want to become an instructional leader? Do I want to go into curriculum development? Do I want to become a mentor of other teachers? There is a sort of future for you, and you have to sort of navigate this through professional investment. Preparing teachers for working in disadvantaged schools. That's something I think Ireland is a great thing. I could have mapped Ireland here, but I didn't have sort of the kind of descriptive data. But Japan, China, Switzerland, very, very good in helping sort of teachers grow into their profession, providing them with the right tools. Improving their working conditions is very important. What many countries are doing now is to work with career and financial incentives. We haven't seen that in Ireland yet, but that's basically the global trend, how you can incentivize people to take on tough courses, tough kind of schools, and build that into kind of pay and career structures. Big trend in many countries, a lot happening in this field. Careers, it's to do with effective employment conditions, about building careers around teaching in tough context, professional development, and again, who actually educates the teachers. Thinking that pipeline through, how do you get people with frontline experience into this process? One of the things, the big trends in high-performing systems is that you actually, in teacher training, you spend a lot of time at the front line with people who actually do that every day, not people who just talk about it. So universities have some role in this, but the classroom experience is actually dominant in this. Finland would be a great example. Japan, many countries putting a lot of emphasis on this. Incentive structures and accountability, always a controversial theme. I don't put them so high because actually this is more on the background of systems. This is not something that will transform things overnight, but it's in a way easy to do. And it's not just, when we talk about accountability is often, how do we make schools more accountable for their results? I would consider this actually a small part of the overall equation. Accountability has to do actually, how do we actually incentivize students to actually take on tough courses rather than courses that are easy? How do we get people to where they are? How do we get teachers to make innovations in pedagogy? Not just reward compliance, which is easy with accountability, but how do you reward actually innovation? How do you get teachers to improve not only their own performance, but also the performance of their colleagues? It's this idea of combining professional autonomy in a collaborative culture. How do you balance vertical accountability, moving information upwards, with lateral accountability, moving information sideways? And so it's a lot, I think, we can learn from this across the world. And I want to just show you a few pieces of data on that. One is basically, how do you use performance data for accountability now? That's something that is not very prevalent in the case of Ireland. In the United States, Netherlands, UK would sort of put a lot of effort into this. But, the relationship with performance is far from obvious. Now, none of those countries at this end are top-performing systems. I think something very important to see, how do you track the data over time? That's probably more important on outcomes. But the use of achievement data is one part of the puzzle, but not a magic key. At least that's what our data show. Percentage of students in schools that use assessment data to monitor teachers, very, very controversial. You can see also a lot of variability on this. And also here, you would see Ireland at the low end of the spectrum. That is not very common, but also in some countries that do it a lot is not the magic key. And I think I'm going to come to this when I talk about accountability systems. It's often about, the balance between accountability and autonomy. Now, how do you get that right? That on the one hand, you build the enabling capacity, you provide the data and evidence, but then you also sort of get that right. Let me show you one piece of data on this. On the vertical axis, you see the performance of education systems. On the horizontal axis, you see the degree of autonomy or responsibility that schools have for substance. This is not about budget, because when it comes to budget and resource allocation, we don't find much of a relationship with performance. When it comes to substance, you can actually see there tends to be a positive relationship between levels of responsibility at the front line and outcomes. And Ireland is, again, sort of an average performer, not very strong, not very weak, and so on. You can see some surprises here. Now, Japan, many people would have this association. This is a highly centralized bureaucratic education system. No? Probably true when you look at the education structures, but when you go actually to schools, no, schools have a lot of responsibility, room to maneuver, and so on. And you can see there is a slight positive relationship. Autonomy on substance is a predictor on learning outcomes, on average. But there's a lot of conditions. Actually, there are a lot of exceptions to this pattern. I want to talk them through with you because I think in the Irish context it's quite relevant to look at this. If you are in an education system where school autonomy just means, the principal decides everything and teachers are not part of that equation, kind of an autocratic leadership, you can actually see that school autonomy works against you. You can see the more autonomous schools are the lower performing schools. The vertical axis is again performance. If you are in an education system where you have a model of distributed leadership, teachers participate in the management, you can see how school autonomy becomes a predictor for success. So this is not just more or less autonomy. This is actually how you build autonomy into the school system. Other example. Very controversial in Ireland. If you have a school system that is not particularly transparent, school autonomy can work against you. If you have an education system where everybody knows what schools achieve, you can actually see school autonomy becomes a predictor for success. So again, transparency and autonomy interrelate. Last point on this. If you have no shared notion of what good mathematics is, that's what this standardized math policy means, basically. Whether schools have a shared understanding of what good performance is, you can actually see that school autonomy works against you. If you do have this kind of shared notion of what good performance is in a school, every school knows, this is what we aspire to, you actually see how school autonomy becomes a predictor for success. So these interrelationships are really, really complex, and you need to look at them in their multiple fashions. Just to sort of some practical examples of this, and I compare Ireland with Singapore here. This is the average. This is Singapore. This is Ireland on different dimensions. Now you can basically see the shared notion. Most schools in Ireland have a pretty good understanding of what good mathematics is and what the school standards mean for them, almost like in Singapore. Talking with other experts, not so common outside the school. Mentoring, every teacher in Singapore gets mentored when they come in. Happening for a lot of teachers, but there are a lot of teachers left out in the case of Ireland. Written feedback from students, who do you actually seek information from? That is a matter of course in a Singaporean school, happens a lot less according to the principles in Ireland. External evaluation, not quite common, self-evaluation and so on, but it's a lot of variability in this. Whereas in Singapore you can really see it's a system that doesn't use only tests or only principal evaluation or only teacher evaluation, that really looks at multiple dimensions. And I just want to show you one example from this, from Singapore. Actually, a couple of years ago, I spent a week in Singapore to look at how they actually have moved to a culture of teacher collaboration. And this didn't fall from the sky. This wasn't sort of ordered by the ministry. In fact, they have worked very, very carefully to create the incentives, the structures, and career paths to actually get teachers to work together to share their experiences. Let me show you a small video clip from this. Listen to this.
To do that, really we get teachers to work together, to collaborate, and to look at each other's practice in the classroom. I think that is essential and really very critical, because the good teaching practices should not reside within the four walls and be kept to one teacher, and I think there is a lot of sharing that we can have in this school.
What you want to do right now is, think of the Socratic questions, what do I want to use to further define, clarify? Now, I will go on the internet, I will find any sort of evidence that will help support this statement or refute it.
Professional learning community community in schools was started basically to ensure that teachers had a platform to develop their teaching practices. Our main focus actually is to make sure that students learn best. And in order to do that, we have to collaborate. We exchange ideas, we try out, we test, and eventually we check for results. And the intention really is to share ideas to make it better for the students.
So again, basically, this is a highly systematic approach. Classroom observation is not, okay, I visit somebody else's classroom. There's actually a very structured approach, video recording, analysis, time invested into this and making this happen. Another example would be Shanghai in China. You know, the way you become popular as a teacher in Shanghai, well, you know, there's a platform where teachers can share their lesson plans. Now, it's up to you whether you do it, but most teachers actually put up the lesson plans, and you become famous by the extent to which other teachers start to use your lessons now, or improve them or comment on them. No? It's like on Facebook. The more hits you get, the more popular become as a teacher. It's creating almost the opposite phenomenon that we have in Europe, where teachers sort of tend to sort of work in isolation in the classroom, keep the material from themselves. There, you know, the more you share your knowledge, the more other people work with what your ideas, improve your ideas, communicate your ideas, the more popular become, and the more likely you are moving up in your own career. So it shows you really how actually public policy can change this culture of teacher collaboration and in looking at evaluation and accountability in a kind of comprehensive way. School choice with equity, I thought that is another dimension that is quite relevant for Ireland. The more transparency you provide, the more choice you give your parents, the more equity is becoming a challenge. And I think that's something that we have learned from looking at this across the world. There's actually a general tendency for equity to be negatively related to the prevalence of choice, on average. But some countries have actually been very, very good in getting those things to work together. When you look actually at the Netherlands, for example, controlled choice votes have been quite powerful in some of the states in the US. Also, that has been working quite well. You can look at financial incentives for schools, making it more attractive for schools to take on, you know, more difficult circumstances, or actually having money following the students. There are different ways of achieving this. Giving parents really good information, absolutely important. Really good data on that, so highly predictive on outcomes. Teacher collaboration. Scotland, a good model, and then using student and school assessments as the way of enhancing transparency. So what I want to say here is actually school choice is always a challenge. It's a great prerequisite to foster competition among schools, a great tool, but it's a challenge to equity, but you can actually address that challenge quite well in the system. And of course, data is always an important part of that dimension. Very last point is really investing resources where they yield most. Sounds trivial. It's actually hard to do because how do you get the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms? No. But actually that's what we see in many of the best performing education systems. They first of all make very effective spending choices. No. They put their money where it can make most of the difference, and they align the resources with the challenges. There's one piece of data that is a bit sort of depressing. You know, I show on the vertical axis performance of a country, and on the horizontal axis, the degree to which resources are equitably spent. Not how much countries spend, but how equitably their resources spent. Why is this depressing? Because you find most countries on the red part, beyond the zero line, basically, we spend more money on students who come from more privileged backgrounds, or better resources. Now, this is often not about quantity, but, for example, looking at teacher quality. And Ireland is no exception from this. No? Not doing particularly bad, not particularly. There are very, very few countries where you can actually say they are successful in getting the more qualified teachers into the more difficult areas. Now, a lot more we can do, but what's interesting is that, you know, more equitable resources do not only yield more equitable results. That's, of course, the natural outcomes. They also seem to yield better results. Equity is a good guarantee for actually efficiency in spending patterns as well. And you can see that when you look at adequacy of resources to address disadvantage now, that's the same kind of pattern on this. Final point is not so relevant for Ireland is tracking and great repetition. We see them as important barriers for equitable and effective learning outcomes, but that's not sort of a challenge in the case of Ireland. And of course, at the end of the day, you want to make things coherent across all aspects of the system. You want to make things consistent over time. And you want to build a good and strong chain between intended policies, implemented policies, and achieved policies. What I think our data shows that all of this can actually be done. Ireland has been a great example of success, has been very successful in moving up its education system. But today, the world-class education systems are still a way out from there. Many of the world's top-performing education systems today haven't been there 10 years ago. I think that's very sort of telling us that the world is really changing very rapidly in this. Thank you very much.